There are a lot of times when real life, real history is far more interesting than anything Hollywood could ever come up with. Such is the case with the story of Wu Zetian, who lived from 625-ish to 705. Now, before your eyes glaze over and you say, "Oh great, just what I wanted, another history lesson," cue the eye roll, you might want to pause and reconsider. This is a woman who went from being a 14-year-old concubine, aka a glorified prostitute, to becoming the only empress in China's long and turbulent, very turbulent history. This is a woman who would do anything to gain and keep power, up to and including killing her own children and relatives, dismembering political rivals and threats, creating her very own secret police to keep those amongst and around her living in a constant state of fear, and the list could go on. I'm not here to give you a history lesson. I'm here to introduce you to a woman who once walked this earth, an exceptional woman. I want to introduce you to her and tell you who she was, what she did, and what she stood for. She was born a pretty long time ago, around 1400 years or so ago, and she was born into the era of the Tang. You've all heard of the Tang Dynasty, right? Well, if you don't know much about it, just know that it was China at what many consider to be its peak as a civilization. Wealth was abound and Chinese culture was flourishing. She was born into that reality. Historically speaking, at least as it pertains to China, not a bad time to be born. What's more is that Wu was born into a fairly well-off family, and she had parents that supported her in terms of education, pursuing her own interests, and developing her own identity. This was very uncommon at the time because everything was extremely patriarchal. It was a man's world. Women knew their place in society and knew damn well that rising up out of the norms and striving for excellence or anything that even slightly resembled equality with men would not only be discouraged, but condemned. So how did a girl born into such a good family who seemed to support her personal development end up being a concubine? One of many in the emperor's harem. I mean, let's not mince words here. Her parents willingly gave up their 13-year-old daughter, still just a child, to an emperor who could literally have his way with her any time he wanted. By today's standards, this sounds not only reprehensible, but abusive and disgusting, not to mention illegal. But remember, we're talking about well over 1,000 years ago, and things were a little different back then. You see, back in those days, being chosen by the emperor to join his circle in any way was considered an unbelievable honor. The emperor was a god amongst men. Being a concubine to him meant prestige, power, and opportunity. As a glorified sex doll, for lack of a better term, to the emperor, that meant that Wu Zetian could continue her studies and continue following her interests and passions. She was most likely set for life and would be able to increase her family's status immensely as well. Furthermore, there was the chance to create offspring with royal blood. This opportunity was a big deal. In a way, it was almost akin to winning the Tang lottery. And so it was. The talented, beautiful, innocent young Wu Zetian, who still went by her birth name, Wu Zhao at the time, packed her bags and got whisked away to the imperial quarters to be a concubine. And who was she going to be concubine to? Well, that would be none other than the one and only Taizong. He was 41, she was 14, possibly 13 even. I want to make it clear that she was not his only concubine, however. This Taizong guy had many, with a capital M, many, girls/teens/women cooped up in the imperial concubine quarters just waiting for his call to see who would be the flavor of the day. So now you know how this talented, charming, beautiful girl ended up being the emperor's 5th-ranked Sunday side play. Yes, they literally ranked their concubines numerically, and Wu was ranked number 5. But there's a whole lot more to the story than that. Like the part where she becomes Empress, ruling over all of China? Yeah, that little historical footnote. So, how did all that happen? Well, you better buckle up because her story only gets crazier from here. Wu's imperial sugar daddy, Taizong, died in 649. She was only 24 years old and now had a decade of experience in concubinehood. I don't think that was a word, but now it is. Anyway, this is where the fun and interesting road almost ended for her. You see, even though she showed unique talent and intelligence at such a young age, she didn't bear any of Taizong's children while serving as his concubine. That should have sealed the deal for her on her future. The custom at the time was that if a concubine didn't have any children with the emperor and he died, well then those childless ladies should go from concubinehood to becoming nuns. Yes, you heard that correctly. If their wombs hadn't produced imperial fruit, they were to be taken to a Buddhist temple and become, yes, nuns. Quite a U-turn, right? Going from mastering the art of making the emperor happy and pleasing him sexually in the bedroom to a life of chastity in a Buddhist monastery for the rest of your life. And that's what almost happened to her. And as you might imagine, she wasn't exactly thrilled about it. Well, she got lucky. And I mean lucky. That fate threw a twist her way that would change her life completely. And it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that it would not only change her life, but to an extent change the course of Chinese history as well. So here's how all this went down. I'm going to condense it down into a short and sweet little nugget for you. Wu Zetian went to the Ganye Temple, which sits just outside of an elementary school in modern-day Xi'an. Yes, this temple still stands. A year later, the new emperor Gaozong went to Ganye Temple to commemorate and pay his respects to his late father, and it was there that he crossed paths with Wu. Now, he was already very familiar with her because of her decade-long stint as his father's concubine. She was happy to see him, so happy in fact that she burst into tears, and he found her quite attractive, and naturally there was some deep-rooted emotion there already due to the family history. Emperor Gaozong was married and his wife was known as Empress Wang. Empress Wang was pretty pissed off at the emperor because of how much he fancied one of his concubines back on the imperial grounds. This concubine's name was Xiao, and the Empress was extremely jealous of her. Empress Wang finagled a plan to get the Emperor to stop paying so much attention to this Xiao concubine lady by convincing the Emperor to bring Wu Zetian back to the imperial court and out of that Buddhist temple. This obviously wouldn't be a good look, as Wu had been his father's concubine, and for an emperor to be dipping in his very own father's sloppy seconds, well, I think you see the issue. And this goes without even mentioning the long list of customs violations. But Empress Wang used her powers of persuasion to make it happen. She thought Wu would be the perfect distraction to get the emperor's eyes off of that concubine named Xiao that Emperor Gaozong just couldn't seem to get enough of. Not the smartest plan, if I may say so myself, but that's neither here nor there. Emperor Gaozong caved, as you might imagine, and he brought Wu Zetian back to the imperial grounds. And this, my friends, is how Wu narrowly avoided spending her life in nunhood. In my view, this marks the point of the true beginning of her rise to power. Sure, the seeds were planted much earlier when she was just a little girl, studying and developing herself with the support and help of her parents. Without those formative years, she wouldn't have become who she became, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about her today. But it was after she left the Ganye Temple and returned to the imperial court that she really started to accumulate power and begin her rise toward the throne. Now, what we are not going to do, however, is to go through a historical, chronological play-by-play of her years and everything that happened when she returned to the imperial grounds in 650 AD, where she would have been about 25 years old, until she officially ascended the throne as Empress in 690, where she would have been around 65. Like I said, I'm not trying to write a history book here. I just want you to know who she was and how she got there. She was not messing around when she got her second chance in the imperial court. She was still a concubine, but she was no longer ranked 5th. She rose up to being the top-ranked concubine in no time, and her influence in all things governance related was growing by leaps and bounds. The emperor had taken quite a liking to her, and it didn't seem like there was any turning back. The ever-jealous Empress Wang was not exactly happy with how things were playing out. She wanted Wu to come back to help take the emperor's eyes off of his then-favorite concubine Xiao. Well, that happened, and then some. The emperor was certainly smitten by Wu Zetian. He did appear to lose interest in Xiao, but it was clear that now the apple of his eye was Wu Zetian. This did not help Empress Wang in any way. She, in effect, went to great efforts to get rid of one problem, only to trade it for a much bigger problem. Mission failed. Hashtag epic fail. Neither Empress Wang nor Xiao the Concubine felt good about Emperor Gaozong's affection for Wu Zetian, and as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And such was the case with Empress Wang and Xiao regarding the newly reviled Wu. So they sort of teamed up and started their planning and plotting. Their jealous rage didn't slow Wu down though. She was busy doing her thing and staying busy with the emperor. Busy both day and night. Their nighttime proclivities were bearing fruit. Within just a couple of years or so, Wu had given the emperor 2 little sons. Can you imagine the look on Empress Wang's face? Holy moly. After giving birth to the 2 sons, Wu then gave birth to a daughter. Here's where things start to take a dark turn. Wu's daughter died just soon after being born. Wu blamed the jealous empress for the death, saying that she strangled the little girl. While nobody knows what really happened, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see the possible motive that the empress might have had for doing such a heinous thing. Things were about to get ugly. After a lot of back and forth, it was finally Wu accusing Empress Wang and Xiao the Concubine, aka Consort Xiao, of practicing witchcraft that dealt the wound shot, which led to them being arrested. And when Wu Zetian got wind of the fact that the emperor was contemplating releasing them, she decided to finish them off with the kill shot. Literally. Depending on which version of history you choose, you might see different reports of how Wu had them killed. Whether it was the throw them into a river version of the story, or the throw them into a vat of wine version of the story, or even the feed them to the pigs version of the story. There is one part that all versions agree on. Both Empress Wang and Xiao's arms and legs were cut off first, while they were still living. I wasn't kidding about the things taking a dark turn part. With Empress Wang ripped to pieces and thrown away, literally, this meant the emperor needed a new wife. I think you see where I'm going with this. Wu Zetian was now a part of the nobility. She was no longer just a concubine. She had ascended to the highest position thought to be possible for a woman at the time. She was now Empress Wu. The more specific title for her at this point was Empress Consort, meaning that she was the wife of a reigning emperor. Think First Lady, something along those lines. From a wide-eyed little 14-year-old concubine to a 30-year-old empress. You've got to admit, that's pretty impressive. This next part of the story looks at how Wu went from being Empress Consort, which remember means that she was Empress only by virtue of the fact that she was married to the Emperor, but she wasn't the one actually calling the shots, to becoming the actual Empress Regnant, or Supreme Leader, to put it in layman's terms. The rule of the roost, the female king, the head honcho, the big cheese. Yeah, that's the Empress Regnant. The process took 35 years, but for all practical matters, she had pretty much already acquired complete power much earlier on. This is where we have to talk a little bit about her significant other at the time, Emperor Gaozong. When you hear the title Emperor, you can't help but to think about strength and power. Well, as for his position of authority, he was the most powerful man in the land. But in a physical sense, Gaozong was no picture of strength. He had been somewhat of a frail and sickly fellow going way back, even into his early years. Wu became his empress in 655, but by 660, just 5 years later, his health had really started to fall apart. Some say that he had a stroke. Dizzy spells became more and more frequent. By this point, he had more or less fully entrusted Wu to call the shots. Gaozong was more or less emperor in name only. The real power was held firmly in the hands of Wu. The capital at this time was called Chang'an, which is modern-day Xi'an, but Wu and the emperor split the capital up into 2 different cities. Chang'an was the capital, but now Luoyang was also capital. One of the big reasons they decided to do this was because Wu was a haunted individual. She was haunted by the deaths of Empress Wang and Xiao the Concubine. She often saw them in her dreams, and it freaked her the hell out. Due to the superstitious nature of the Chinese, especially back in those days, this would have been viewed as the spirits of the Empress and Xiao following her, haunting her. So Wu thought it best to create some distance from herself and the scene of the crime, so they left Chang'an and spent the vast majority of their time in Luoyang. By 665, Wu made her position of authority blatantly obvious. She would attend meetings with the emperor, where she would sit behind a pearl screen and actually issue orders on her own, cross her, betray her, or even make her feel slightly threatened at your own peril. The results could be, and usually were, deadly. Allow me to illustrate with two infamous examples. In the first one, she had one of her very own nieces poisoned simply because the emperor found her attractive, and she was afraid the emperor might want to eventually get a little closer and more personal with her. So to avoid that, a little bit of poison, drip drip, dead, done, problem solved. And in the second example, we're going to look at the account of Wu having her very own firstborn son killed because he was the crown prince and was showing disapproval with his mother's level of involvement in imperial decision-making. He reportedly even asked her to chill out a little bit, which ultimately resulted in his demise. Now, it would be easy for one to assume that she must have been this really horrible, terrible human being to commit such acts. But life in Tang-era China was brutal and very cutthroat, and unfortunately such atrocious things were sort of par for the course back then. Let's get away from all this dark and depressing murder-related stuff and take a look at the spiritual side of Wu Zetian. She was a longtime proponent of Buddhism and a personal practitioner of the Buddhist belief system as well. One really interesting thing that you can still see today is the Buddhist statue that she paid to have carved into the Longmen grottos near Luoyang. She was in her late 40s when she ordered this to be built, and many believe it was carved in the likeness of herself, particularly in the facial features. Now, back to the dark and deadly stuff along her quest for absolute power. She spent a lot of years by the sickly emperor's side, 28 years to be exact. But in the year of 683, the good Lord came a-calling and Emperor Gaozong breathed his last breath. Now, one might assume that this is when Wu made her ultimate power play and seized the throne for herself. Well, it didn't exactly work out like that. As custom had it, one of Gaozong's sons must assume the throne. Wu wanted it for herself, make no mistake about it. But she couldn't just take it. She had to play by the rules. Well, some of them at least. So she had her son take the throne. The late emperor had left it in his will that the new emperor should consult with mommy on virtually all matters. So whichever way you slice it, Wu Zetian was the de facto ruler of all China already. She just needed an obedient son to sit atop the throne as a figurehead and, as they'd say in Chinese, 听话, or be obedient. He didn't last long though. Unimpressed with her son, she snatched his ass off the throne after only a few weeks and installed another son. This was her youngest son, a man named Li Dan, who went by the name Ruizong after he took the throne. The poor guy was powerless. His mom neutered him on day one, figuratively speaking, of course. As Emperor of China, he wasn't even allowed to live in the imperial apartments, nor was he allowed to attend meetings. His mother was, at this point, in complete charge. His actual rule was a complete joke, an impotent, neutered figurehead that knew how to jump when mommy said jump. To add insult to injury to our pitiful buddy Emperor Ruizong, his own actual mother had his wife killed based on accusations of practicing, that's right, witchcraft, or plotting against her, or who knows, maybe a combination of both. The fact remains Wu Zetian had her youngest son's wife killed. The murder tally and blood on Wu's hands was pretty substantial by this point, and she didn't discriminate either. Personal offspring, blood relation, friend or foe, be damned. Seeing that her sons apparently weren't up to the task, she decided that it was officially time to make that long-awaited power play. And in the year 690, she forced her son to step down, and she, at the age of 65-ish, ascended the throne. She was now, by name, the official supreme leader. the Empress regnant. For anyone listening to this, I think it's imperative that we take a step back and readjust the lens that we are viewing this woman's life through. Wu Zetian was now Empress of all China. This had never happened before, and it never happened again. This was never supposed to happen. Even today, China is a patriarchal society, but back in those days, nearly 1400 years ago, it was much, much, much worse. Wu Zetian had bucked the long-standing Confucian patriarchal order. So keep that in mind while you're hearing about her life. To say that a lot of people, especially men, were livid about her ascension to the throne would be a massive understatement. She had risen to a position of power that had previously been viewed as literally impossible. Like I said, this was never supposed to happen. She achieved it against all odds, in defiance of the long-established order. So if you think she sounded a little paranoid or unnecessarily brutal, please keep in mind the societal backdrop that she was operating against. Without a healthy dose of paranoia and brutality, she wouldn't have ever gotten there. Knowing what she was up against, she took proactive measures to try to make her foes think twice before trying anything funny. She created what would today be considered her very own secret police to seek out and crush her opposition, all the while keeping everyone in a constant state of fear. She had copper mailboxes set up around the capital so people could rat each other out. False accusations, unjust arrests, torture, false confessions, terror. These are all words and terms that would be common in any in-depth analysis of Wu's Stasi-like security forces. According to Wu Zetian, she marked the end of the Tang Dynasty by starting what she called the Zhou Dynasty, although historians and dictionaries would beg to disagree with her because according to definition, in order for it to be an actual dynasty, there would have to be at least 2 successive rulers, of which there were not. I personally tend to look at it as sort of a hidden gem tucked within the years of the legendary Tang Dynasty. Look, you can call it whatever you want. The fact remains that it was the Wu Zetian era. It was a long road that brought Wu to the throne. After seeking absolute power for so long, we have to ask the question, how did she finally do when she got there? Considering that in many ways the decks were stacked against her simply due to the fact that she was a female, she really needed to overperform in order to prove herself. In other words, she needed to rule better than a man. Let's look at a few notable achievements that took place under her reign. Women's status. Women enjoyed more liberty to pursue their interests, and they were given a boost in status. Societal attitudes and respect towards women improved and increased during these years. Nepotism. Nepotism was lessened. Wu Zetian was a firm believer in merit-based promotion rather than links and connections to those in powerful positions being the determining factor. Religious tolerance. Wu embraced and was a major proponent in the spread of Buddhism throughout the land. Food security. The possibility of starvation resulting from poor harvests due to drought was very real in that era. Wu had many massive granaries constructed using the most cutting-edge technology at the time. These granaries were the largest to date and could store rice for up to 10 years. She ensured that her people would be well fed. Expanding the empire. Wu's armies led expeditions to expand and broaden the border of the empire, even annexing significant parts of the Korean peninsula. And improving economy. Wu's economic policies were improving the plight of peasants. It was also a time of trade flourishing throughout the empire. Some historians believe there were roughly 25,000 foreigners in China at the time, most of whom were trying to acquire China's world-class silk. Arts and literature flourished as well. Overall, times were good in Wu's China, and she proved herself to be a very competent and effective ruler. Well, as the story usually goes, you climb really, really hard for a really, really long time, and then you maybe reach the top, which Wu Zetian most certainly did. There was literally nowhere else for her to climb. Well, excluding spiritual endeavors, she had reached the actual top. And once you're at the top, you try to maintain it as long as you can, and you struggle, and you strive, and you scrape and claw. But then the inevitable fall comes. Wu Zetian officially ruled over China for 15 years. Unofficially, she ruled China for damn near half a century. She first stepped into the imperial court at the tender age of 14. She was entering her years as an elder when she took the throne at the age of 65 or 66. She left this world at the age of 81. The year was 705. Although her reign ended in 705, it was almost a decade before that when the storm clouds really started to loom on the horizon. In 696, skirmishes and clashes on the border became increasingly common and problematic. In 697, she started her well-documented fling with two younger men, most commonly known as the Zhang brothers. These men did not only engage with her sexually, keep in mind she was in her 70s at this point, but they got involved in the imperial court as well. They had a surprising amount of leeway and influence in the court, receiving no shortage of favors and promotions by Wu Zetian. By this time, Wu was getting quite old. With old age usually comes fatigue, health problems, and other issues that make one want to sort of just kick back and relax. Wu Zetian, although larger than life, was still human after all. With the Zhang brothers came political drama, and in 705 a coup was carried out which forced Wu to step down and abdicate the throne. She had one hell of a run, but at last, this was the end of the line. The Zhang brothers were killed, and Wu Zetian was deposed. According to most accounts, this happened in February. By December, that same year, she was dead. She left this world just as she entered it, by way of natural causes. Now, the next line is gonna make you laugh, but it's unintentional. Today, her body rests out by Nipple Hills. I'm serious, guys. Wipe that smirk off your face. Her body rests at Qianling Mausoleum, which is located just outside of Xi'an City and sits between Nipple Hills. Would it be foolish of me to ask you to guess why that place is called Nipple Hills? Yeah, you guessed it. It's not like it was that hard. It's two roundish, smooth hills that to some, with a lot of time on their hands and a one-track mind, resembles human breasts. So adolescent, don't you think? But that's where her body is, still today, and she is interred there sleeping in a tomb just next to the main man in her life, Emperor Gaozong, to whom she was married until death did them part. Now, if you Google Wu Zetian or read historical accounts of her life, the impression you'll get of her will vary greatly, depending on what you read and who wrote it. In decades past, she was viewed very harshly and cast in an extremely negative light. These days, though, things are starting to change and most historians are starting to view her much more favorably. One thing you've got to remember is that he who writes the history books writes history itself. Those who wrote the first accounts of her were generally her fiercest opponents. They were staunch advocates of the Confucian patriarchal order. She was everything they thought a woman shouldn't be. She was educated. She pushed for the betterment of the plight of women in a world that wanted to keep them repressed. She showed that if a man is allowed to enjoy himself sexually, then so too should a woman be. She was powerful, so powerful in fact that she reached the pinnacle of power. She was the supreme authority over every man, woman, and child within the expanses of the empire. I also can't help but feel that many of the male historians, if we can even call them that, who wrote so critically of her, were experiencing personal feelings of inadequacy, jealousy, and resentment because here was a woman who, according to their belief system, was not supposed to be able to do what she did. She was supposed to be inferior to men and to know her place. But boy, oh boy, did she step out of bounds, and when she did, it rocked the entire foundation of the male-dominated chauvinistic order. Not only did she achieve a position that was believed to be for men, but in many ways, she outperformed them. She showed a level of competence and forward thinking that many of her male contemporaries could only dream of aspiring to. But initially, it was mainly those who despised her that wrote the history books. Probably not the most objective and balanced perspectives. Nowadays, history is starting to be a little more fair to her and starting to view her within the context of the era. Put simply, most of the things that she was condemned for doing during her time in the imperial court are things that male rulers did on a regular basis, and even to much more extreme degrees, yet they were given a pass and often praised by historians. Fair? Not at all. Sexist? Very much so. Could there have been maybe some double standards at play here? You bet your ass there were. For my purposes here, I simply wanted to show her in a fair and balanced way. I wanted to portray her as the human she was rather than some name and date in a history book. The fact is that she stepped into the imperial realm as a wide-eyed, innocent little 14-year-old and became a concubine. It was in this realm that her innocence was taken away. Sex, jealousy, adultery, murder, manipulation. This was the cutthroat world of the Tang-era imperial court. As her innocence disappeared, her wisdom and cunningness grew. Her natural intelligence and beauty gave her an edge over much of the competition. Like I said before, she was never supposed to be the ruler of China. There were a million reasons why it was impossible. Yet, she did it. This wasn't some sort of overnight success story. This was a lifetime of effort and a lifelong journey. What she achieved is nothing short of remarkable. Despite all of the early haters and detractors out there that tried so desperately to destroy your name, reputation, and trivialize your remarkable achievements, their efforts were made in vain, Empress Wu. You won the long game, and now history sees you for what you were, an amazing ruler who simply did what she needed to do. And regarding the stele that stands near your final resting spot that was left blank, it doesn't really matter. We can use our own minds to fill it in. Besides, there would have been too much to write, and words wouldn't have done your life justice anyway. It only helps to maintain the theme that seemed to continue throughout your life, being unique in all ways, always. Rest easy, Empress.